Hello, students. Welcome to another episode of the Psychology Lesson. Many psychology students have confusion about the research methods in psychology. So today, I will show you how interesting psychology research methods are. Prior to the 1850s, psychology was considered a branch of philosophy. At that time, even philosophers believed that measuring human behavior was useless because human thoughts and behaviors could not be observed directly. However, after the 1850s, psychology began forming new alliances with sciences such as chemistry, physics, and biology. Biologists and physicists were pioneers in conducting experiments to measure human behavior. The first psychology laboratory was established by the famous German physiologist Wilhelm Wundt in 1879 at Leipzig University to study psychological reactions. Let's explore some major research methods in psychology, starting with observational studies. Observational study is one of the fundamental methods in scientific research. Observation simply means to look or view. This method can be conducted in two ways: aided observation and direct or unaided observation. Aided observation involves using instruments such as MRI or ECG to study covert behaviors or implicit functions in specific situations, like brain and neural functions, functions of different body parts, etc. Direct or unaided observation, on the other hand, does not involve any instruments and focuses on explicit, overt behaviors that can be observed with the naked eye, like laughs, expressions, etc. Observational studies are broadly classified into naturalistic versus controlled observation and participant versus non-participant observation. Naturalistic observation. I, psychologist sitting in a coffee shop, taking notes on how people interact. This is an example of naturalistic observation, where the focus is on studying people in their natural setting without any manipulation. The best part? The behavior is real and authentic because this method allows for findings to be generalized to real-life settings, as behaviors observed in its natural context. But the downside? Too many uncontrollable factors. This makes it hard to replicate the study. Now, compare that with controlled observation. In controlled observation, researchers set up a structured environment, like a lab, to study specific behaviors. Here, variables are controlled, making it easier to replicate results. But there's a catch. Because the setting is artificial, the behavior may not reflect real-life interactions accurately. So, which method is better? It depends on what you're studying. Based on the level of researcher involvement, the observation can be participant or non-participant observation. Non-participant observation. Imagine you are a principal who wants to observe how teachers interact with students. You have options like installing a camera or sitting in a corner to quietly watch what is happening. This is an example of non-participant observation. This helps keep things objective, ensuring that the researcher does not influence participants' behavior. But it might miss out on deeper insights that could be gained from direct engagement. Participant observation. Now, in participant observation, the researcher actually joins the group, blending in to get first-hand experience. This method gives rich insights, but there's a risk of bias if the researcher gets too emotionally involved, so it loses objectivity. Next is experimental studies. The experimental method is considered the most scientific method of study, as it establishes cause-effect relationships between variables in a controlled setting. Experiments are carefully designed to determine how one factor influences another, while keeping everything else constant. Before we go any further, let's clarify some important terms. A variable is any factor that can change and be measured. For example, a pen itself is not a variable, but its color, shape, and size are variables because they can vary. Similarly, a room itself is not a variable, but its size is because rooms can come in different sizes. Now, let's look at the different types of variables. Independent variable. Independent variable is the variable that the researcher manipulates. It's the cause in the experiment. Dependent variable. Dependent variable is what the researcher measures. It's the effect. For example, if we want to study whether writing a test in the same room versus a different room affects performance, the room where the test is taken is the independent variable, and the dependent variable would be the test scores, as they change based on the independent variable. Now, let's talk about extraneous variables. Extraneous variables are factors that could unintentionally influence the dependent variable. In our test scenario, things like a student's mood, lighting in the room, or room temperature could all impact performance. These all are extraneous variable. Researchers try to control these variables to ensure accurate results. Experiments typically have two groups, the experimental group and the control group. An experimental group consists of members who are exposed to the manipulation of the independent variable. In contrast, the control group serves as a comparison group and is treated similarly to the experimental group, except it does not receive the manipulated variable. For example, if a researcher is testing a new medication, the experimental group would receive the actual drug, while the control group might receive a placebo, which could be a sugar pill or saline injection. If there is a significant difference in outcomes between the two groups, the researcher can conclude that the medication had an effect. In experimental research, there are four primary methods used to explore cause and effect relationships: lab experiments, field experiments, natural experiments, and quasi-experiments. Lab experiments. Lab experiments are conducted in a highly controlled environment where the researcher deliberately manipulates the independent variable to observe its effect on the dependent variable. For example, imagine a psychologist testing how background music impacts memory retention. Participants are assigned to either an experimental group, those listening to music while studying, or a control group, those studying in silence. After a short break, both groups take a memory recall test. The results show that the control group remembers more words, suggesting that background music could interfere with memory. Strengths of lab experiments include using standardized procedures and making it easy to control other variables. This means it's simpler to establish cause and effect relationships. But there's a problem. Because these experiments are in artificial settings, they might not reflect real-world behavior. That means they often lack ecological validity, and participants might behave differently because they know they're being studied. Let's talk about field experiments. Field experiments happen in natural settings, like a park or a school, where the researcher observes real-world behaviors. For example, a researcher might want to know if people are more likely to help someone who drops papers when they're alone versus when there are others around. Strengths of field experiments are their high ecological validity, meaning they reflect real-world behaviors. However, control becomes more difficult in these environments. You can't control everything, like weather or distractions, which may affect the results. Plus, ethical issues could arise if people don't know they're part of the experiment. Let's look at natural experiments. In natural experiments, the researcher doesn't manipulate the independent variable. Something naturally occurs, like a natural disaster or an event, and the researcher records how it impacts the dependent variable. For instance, researchers might study how people's mental health is affected after a hurricane hits a community. The strength here is that real-life events give us high ecological validity, and we get to study things that we couldn't create in a lab, like gender or natural disasters. But random allocation of participants isn't possible in these experiments, and the events themselves might be rare, making it difficult to repeat the study. Finally, we have quasi-experiments. These are a mix between lab and natural experiments. While the researcher might manipulate the IV, there's no random assignment of participants. For example, if a new teaching method is being tested in two different schools, but the students are already grouped by their school, that's a quasi-experiment. The strength of quasi-experiments is that they often follow true experimental designs, so they can be replicated and the results can be generalized to larger groups. But without random assignment. There's a risk of participant variables affecting the results, making it harder to establish cause and effect. Let's summarize. So, there you have it, the major research methods in psychology. But there are still other methods I haven't covered in this video, and we'll dive into those in the next one. Remember, experiments help us understand how and why things happen, but choosing the right method is key to getting reliable results. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more psychology content, and drop a comment below if you have any questions or suggestions for our next video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.